It began on a night so quiet, the silence itself seemed to hold its breath. Michigan, 2003. A small street dusted with fresh snow. Porch lights glowed faintly against the winter darkness, their halos dim in the falling flurries. Somewhere in that frozen stillness, footsteps echoed, a steady crunch of boots pressing into untouched drifts. Then, just as suddenly, they stopped. The woman walking home was young, just 22. She carried nothing but her purse and a set of keys jingling faintly in her coat pocket. To anyone watching, she might have seemed safe. After all, this was a town where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors waved from porches, where the greatest threat usually came from icy roads, not human hands. But safety is fragile, and that night it shattered. When dawn broke, the discovery was chilling. Her tracks wound neatly through the powder, crossing 1 yard, skirting a lamppost, then veering toward the quiet stretch of Birchwood Avenue. The snow was smooth and unbroken, except where her footprints ended. Just ended. No sign of a struggle, no drag marks, no continuation in any direction. It was as if she had simply vanished into the cold air. Police sirens cut through the morning calm. Red and blue lights splashed across the white drifts as officers combed the scene, their boots trampling what remained of the fragile evidence. Neighbors gathered in hushed clusters, clutching steaming coffee mugs, their breath clouding in the cold. One whispered, "Her prints just stop," like she disappeared into the ground. Another claimed he saw something, a dark figure, half hidden in the tree line. "I thought I saw someone," he said later, voice trembling, but then nothing. The woman's family was frantic. Her mother's cries carried down the block as she begged officers to search again, to look harder, to bring her daughter back. Detectives moved quickly, knocking on doors, canvassing the street, asking the same urgent questions. Who was outside last night? Did anyone hear a car door slam? Did anyone see headlights sweep across the snow? But answers were scarce, and the questions only grew heavier. How does someone vanish from a street that quiet? How do footprints end in the middle of an open path, as though swallowed whole? As the day faded into night, the sense of dread spread. By the second evening, television cameras had arrived, broadcasting shaky images of search parties pushing through snowbanks with flashlights. The reporter's voice was taut with disbelief. A young woman disappears while walking home. Her trail leads here, and then ends. For the town, the unthinkable had become reality. A neighbor was missing. Fear settled like frost on every window, every whispered conversation. Behind every door, families double-checked locks they had never bothered with before. Her footprints just stopped, and so did the town's peace. Before the snow, before the flashing lights, before the whispers of fear, there was just an ordinary young woman living an ordinary life. Her name was Emily Sanders, 22 years old, a college student home for winter break, balancing shifts at a local diner while saving for her next semester's tuition. She grew up in the heart of Birchwood, Michigan, a place where everyone knew one another's names and history stretched back generations. Birchwood was the kind of town where church bells marked the hours, where Friday night basketball games drew crowds to the high school gym, and where the corner store clerk always asked about your family before bagging your groceries. To the people who lived there, Birchwood felt untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Emily fit seamlessly into that rhythm. Each morning she rose early in her small lavender-painted bedroom at her parents' house, slipping into jeans and her favorite navy sweater before heading to work. At the diner she was a familiar smile, pouring coffee, remembering regulars' orders, and joking lightly with the older men who gathered each morning to argue about sports and politics. Her co-workers recalled her as kind but ambitious, a young woman who carried herself with quiet determination. She dreamed of finishing her degree in social work. She wanted, she told her friends, to help people rebuild their lives. At home, Emily was the eldest daughter, the one her mother leaned on when bills piled high, or when her younger brother got into trouble at school. The family was close-knit, bound together by nightly dinners around the oak table in their modest kitchen. Her father, a machinist at the local plant, would ask her about her classes. Her mother, a quiet but perceptive woman, often reminded Emily not to trust too easily. Looking back, that warning carries a haunting weight. In the weeks before her disappearance, nothing seemed unusual. Emily laughed with her friends at a holiday party. She took her little brother ice skating on the frozen pond by the park. She mailed a stack of resumes to internships out of town, excited about the possibilities. The life she was building seemed steady, hopeful, open, and yet beneath the surface of Birchwood's tidy streets, unease lingered. Not everyone in town spoke of it openly, but rumors traveled quickly in small places. A burglary last fall, a car prowling slowly down back roads late at night, a girl from a neighboring county who had been followed home from the library. Small, scattered incidents, easy to dismiss in isolation, harder to ignore when taken together. At the diner, some customers muttered about it in hushed tones, lowering their voices whenever a stranger walked through the door. Parents told their daughters to be careful, though most still believed Birchwood was safe. After all, nothing truly terrible ever happened here. Not yet. For Emily, life continued as it always had. Friends described her as trusting, perhaps a little too willing to see the good in people. She was the kind of person who would stop to help a stranger with a flat tire, or offer directions to someone passing through town. It was part of what made her beloved, and perhaps part of what made her vulnerable, because in Birchwood, as winter deepened and snow blanketed the quiet streets, danger was watching, hidden, patient, waiting for its chance, and soon that chance would come. December 12, 2003. The day had been ordinary, the kind that slips easily into memory without distinction. Emily worked the evening shift at the diner, starting at 4 o'clock sharp. The regulars came and went, clinking forks against chipped plates, steaming coffee rising into the air as snow continued to fall outside. At 9:15 p.m., she clocked out. A co-worker later remembered her smiling as she tugged her scarf tightly around her neck, promising she'd be back for the next shift. She stepped outside into the crisp air, her breath turning instantly white. The snow had lightened, flakes falling in delicate spirals beneath the yellow glow of the street lamps. From there her route was simple, just under a mile home, down Maple Street, past the church, cutting across a quiet residential block where houses stood dark and silent, curtains drawn against the cold. At 9:27 p.m., a neighbor across the street saw her pass by. Emily waved, though she didn't cross over to chat. Her boots crunched on the icy pavement, steady, rhythmic. She looked like any other young woman heading home after work, careful but unafraid. Minutes later, she made a brief call on her flip phone, back when conversations were short, when texts were still clumsy and slow. Her mother recalled later, she just said she'd be home soon. That was it. Just soon. The call ended at 9:34 p.m., and then the timeline grows thinner. A man walking his dog noticed her at 9:40 p.m., near the corner of Birchwood Avenue. He remembered because the dog barked at her, startling Emily. She laughed nervously, waved at him, and continued forward. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. What happened in the next few minutes has haunted investigators for years. The weather was cold, the streets nearly empty. One streetlight flickered faintly, struggling against the heavy air. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine hummed, though no headlights were seen. And then silence, no screams, no calls for help, just silence, broken only by the muffled fall of snow. By 10 p.m., her mother began pacing at home. Emily should have been back already. She checked the clock, checked the window, then tried calling her daughter's phone. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. By 10:30 p.m., worry had hardened into dread. She called a neighbor, then the police. When officers arrived, they retraced Emily's path. They followed her footprints in the snow, down Maple Street, past the church, across the block, and then just as she reached the stretch of Birchwood Avenue where the dog walker had last seen her, nothing. The tracks simply ended. No broken branches, no drag marks, No tire impressions leading away, just the final imprint of a boot heel pressed deep into the snow, followed by emptiness. Neighbors reported nothing unusual. One said she thought she heard a car door shut around that time, but she couldn't be certain. Another mentioned a shadow moving near the trees, but it vanished before she could focus her eyes. Fragments, pieces of a puzzle without edges. What remains is a timeline that narrows into a terrifying gap. 9:40 p.m. Emily seen alive. 10 p.m. She's gone. In just 20 minutes, a young woman disappeared without a trace from the middle of a quiet Michigan street, and for the police, that was only the beginning. The first 48 hours of any investigation are critical. In Emily's case, those hours unraveled with urgency, but also with chaos. By midnight, the Sanders' modest home on Birchwood Avenue had become a staging ground. Police cars lined the street, their headlights casting sharp beams across the snow. Detectives gathered in the living room, notebooks open, radios crackling. Emily's mother sat trembling on the couch, clutching her daughter's scarf, while her father paced endlessly, his face pale and rigid with anger. The search began immediately. Officers walked the length of Birchwood Avenue again and again, flashlights sweeping across the frozen ground. They found the footprints, those haunting tracks that simply ended, and tried to preserve them with photographs. But in their haste, boots trampled over vital impressions. Later forensic specialists would lament how much evidence was lost in those first frantic hours. By dawn, the case had already drawn attention. Local reporters arrived, their breath clouding in the cold as they spoke into cameras. "A young woman has vanished in Birchwood," one news anchor declared, her voice tense. "Police are investigating what may be a possible abduction." Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors. A woman recalled hearing a car engine idling around 9:45 p.m. No, she hadn't looked outside. A teenage boy mentioned seeing a shadow near the tree line, but admitted he might have imagined it. Another neighbor claimed he heard muffled voices, though he couldn't say if they were male or female. Each detail was small, fragile and frustratingly inconclusive. Back at headquarters, investigators pored over the timeline. They circled 9:40 p.m., the moment Emily was last seen, and built outward. Who might have been driving in the area at that time? Which residents had security cameras? However grainy, leads were thin, but the pressure was immense. Forensic teams collected what they could. Fibers from Emily's scarf, partial shoe prints near the curb, too smudged to match, tire marks on a patch of slush, possibly from a sedan, possibly from something else entirely. Even her phone offered little. The battery had died shortly after her last call to her mother. The community's fear intensified. Parents demanded answers. Rumors twisted through the town like smoke. Some whispered that Emily had run away, though those who knew her dismissed it instantly. Others suspected a stranger passing through, and in quiet corners, suspicion even turned inward, toward neighbors, toward friends, toward anyone who couldn't immediately account for their time that night. Detective Mark Hanley, the lead investigator, addressed the press on the second day. His words were steady, but his jaw was tight. "We are treating this as a suspicious disappearance. Our officers are following every lead. We will find out what happened to Emily Sanders." But behind closed doors, Hanley confided to his team, nothing was adding up. Abductions leave traces, signs of a struggle, marks on the ground, something. Here, there was almost nothing, just silence and vanishing footprints. Red herrings surfaced quickly. A man living 2 streets over was questioned after a neighbor claimed he behaved oddly that night. Another resident reported a stranger's car parked near the church. Both leads dissolved under scrutiny, but they drained precious time and energy. By the end of the week, frustration had settled in. Emily's family appeared at a televised plea, her mother clutching her daughter's photo as tears streaked her cheeks. "Please, if anyone knows anything, please bring her home." The detectives worked around the clock, but with each day that passed, the trail grew colder, evidence was scarce, and witnesses conflicted. And in Birchwood, fear turned to something else, suspicion. Neighbors began to look at one another differently, because if someone in town had taken Emily, then that meant the danger was much closer than anyone wanted to believe. In the days that followed, Birchwood changed. What had once been a town defined by open doors and friendly nods now carried the weight of suspicion. The disappearance of Emily Sanders was no longer just a police matter. It was the heart of every whispered conversation, every cautious glance across a grocery aisle, every parent walking their child to school instead of letting them go alone. The local church held a vigil 3 nights after she went missing. The pews were filled with neighbors holding candles, their flickering flames reflected in the stained glass windows. Prayers were spoken aloud, but beneath the solemn words ran an undercurrent of fear. People weren't just praying for Emily's safe return, they were praying that whatever had happened to her wouldn't happen again. Businesses in town responded swiftly. The diner where Emily had worked began closing an hour earlier. Lights dimmed and doors locked before the streets grew too quiet. Hardware stores sold out of padlocks and motion lights. Parents formed informal patrols, escorting their daughters home from evening shifts. Birchwood's innocence, once its most defining trait, had evaporated overnight. Whispers filled the air. In line at the post office, someone muttered that it must have been an outsider. No one from here would do such a thing. But across town, a woman told her neighbor she suspected someone local. Who else would know the streets that well? Who else could watch and wait without being seen? The rumor spread, twisting with every retelling. Emily's family became the face of the tragedy. Her father appeared stoic in public, jaw clenched, his voice steady as he thanked searchers and volunteers. But friends whispered that behind closed doors, he was unraveling, barely eating, pacing through the night, eyes hollow from lack of sleep. Her mother spoke at town meetings, urging anyone with information to come forward. Each word seemed to drain her strength, as though hope itself was slipping away. At the high school gym, a community meeting drew a crowd. Police stood at the front, urging calm, but the atmosphere was charged. Voices rose. Why aren't you doing more? How could this happen here? What if she's still alive, waiting for help? The questions had no easy answers. Tension simmered until it spilled into accusations, neighbors turning on one another, fear feeding mistrust. Still, for all the division, there was unity too. Volunteers joined search parties combing the woods, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness. Flyers bearing Emily's photo were taped to every shop window and pinned to telephone poles. Her smile stared back at them, a haunting reminder of the life still missing. But underneath every effort, one truth loomed: no one felt safe anymore. Birchwood had been pierced by something dark and unexplainable, and until answers came, the fear would not lift. And for detectives that fear was fuel. They had to push harder, they had to find her, because if they failed, Birchwood would remain a town defined not by its closeness, but by its silence. For Detective Mark Hanley, the case of Emily Sanders quickly became more than an assignment. It became an obsession. Hanley was seasoned 15 years on the force, with a reputation for persistence, but nothing in his career had prepared him for the sheer emptiness of this investigation. He replayed the facts endlessly. A young woman, walking home, footprints that stopped, no body, no struggle, no witness who could say with certainty what happened. It was a riddle wrapped in ice, and it burrowed into him. His office grew cluttered with maps, photographs and timelines. A large corkboard dominated the wall, string connecting names, dates, and faint theories. He spent long hours tracing Emily's last known path with his finger, searching for what he might have overlooked. The pressure weighed on him, and it showed. His wife later recalled how he barely came home, and when he did, he sat at the kitchen table staring into the dark, coffee growing cold beside him. Every new lead sparked a surge of hope. A tip about a suspicious vehicle, a call from a passerby claiming to have seen headlights near the church. Hanley chased them all, working his team to exhaustion, but time after time, The leads collapsed into nothing, each dead end dug deeper into his resolve, and deeper into his personal life. Sleep became rare. He would lie awake at night, hearing the crunch of boots in snow, imagining Emily's final steps. He pictured her stopping suddenly, turning her head. He pictured a hand reaching out, a shadow moving just beyond the edge of lamplight. The images tormented him, filling the gaps left by the missing evidence. His colleagues noticed the change. He barked orders with sharper urgency, grew restless during briefings, and scribbled notes furiously during interviews. When questioned about his intensity, he brushed it aside. "This case isn't cold," he told a fellow detective. "We just haven't asked the right questions yet." Forensic work consumed him too. He pushed the lab for answers they couldn't yet provide, urging them to test fibers, soil samples, even faint impressions in snow that had long since melted. Early 2000s technology limited them. DNA databases were in their infancy, and the smallest trace could take weeks, even months to process. Hanley wanted results yesterday. Meanwhile, the Sanders family grew desperate. They called him daily, sometimes multiple times, their voices trembling with equal parts hope and frustration. "Detective, you'll find her, won't you? Please don't stop looking." Their pleas only sharpened his determination. To them, Hanley was not just an investigator, he was their last lifeline. But obsession has its cost. His marriage strained under the weight of his long absences. His children stopped expecting him at the dinner table. Even his health began to erode. Hollow eyes, jittering hands, a perpetual ache in his chest. Yet still he pressed on, convinced that one detail, one overlooked fragment, would finally break the silence. And perhaps it was his intensity that kept the case alive at all. While other files drifted into drawers, Emily stayed on his desk, marked by dog-eared pages and highlighted notes. The department knew Hanley would not let this case go, but for all his obsession, for all the nights spent combing through shadows, the answers refused to come. Leads slipped through his fingers, suspects emerged, then dissolved, and as the years stretched forward, the case would test not only his resolve, but his very sanity, because nothing haunts a detective more than silence. The search for Emily Sanders did not end in that first week, or that first year. It stretched onward through winters and summers, across decades marked by disappointment and silence. Early on, detectives pursued every possible lead. A drifter passing through town was questioned after someone reported seeing him near the church on the night of Emily's disappearance. He was tall, gaunt, with a history of minor thefts. For a brief moment, suspicion swirled around him, but his alibi, confirmed by bus tickets and surveillance from a truck stop 40 miles away, cleared him. The town had nearly convinced itself of his guilt, only to be forced back into uncertainty. Other suspects followed. A former boyfriend of Emily's, scrutinized after an argument weeks before she vanished. A neighbor with a reputation for drinking heavily and wandering late at night. A co-worker at the diner who had once asked Emily out and been politely rejected. Each was questioned, analyzed, weighed against the evidence, or lack thereof. None fit. Each theory crumbled under investigation. Forensic science, though advancing, offered little salvation in those early years. Samples collected from Emily's belongings were too limited, too degraded. Snow, time, and contamination had destroyed what might have been useful. The partial tire tracks, smudged and half-frozen, matched dozens of vehicles but none conclusively. The fibers on her scarf were traced, tested and ultimately dismissed. Year after year, hope faltered. The Sanders family sat through interviews, vigils and anniversaries, their grief calcifying into something heavier. Emily's mother kept her daughter's room untouched, lavender walls frozen in time. Her father aged visibly, his once strong frame bent under the weight of absence. Holidays came and went, each one marked not by celebration, but by the empty chair at the table. The case file grew thicker, swelling with reports,
tips and dead ends. Newspaper headlines reflected the shifting tides of attention. Police follow new lead in Sanders' case. Family still holds out hope. 5 years later, no answers. Each story reignited whispers in town, each story ending in the same haunting conclusion: nothing. Detective Hanley remained tethered to the case, though the years carved lines into his face and dimmed his once burning certainty. His notes became increasingly desperate. Check landfill records again. Revisit anonymous tip from 2005. Re-interview diner staff. He interrogated the same suspects more than once, chasing ghosts of contradictions. But no matter how many times he retraced the timeline, the footprints still ended in snow. For the community, the fear softened into resignation. Birchwood carried on. Children grew into adults. Businesses opened and closed. Yet the name Emily Sanders was never forgotten. Her photo remained pinned on bulletin boards long after the paper yellowed at the edges. Every new disappearance in neighboring counties brought her case back to the surface, raising questions, comparisons, and fleeting hope. The Sanders family, meanwhile, learned the cruel rhythm of anniversaries. The 10th year brought renewed media attention, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. But the interviews felt like rituals of despair. Pleas shouted into an uncaring void. Emily's brother, now grown, admitted bitterly, "We've been living in pause. Everyone else moves forward. We can't." By the 20th year, silence had become its own kind of. It seemed the truth had been buried forever, somewhere beneath snow and time. But silence, however long it lasts, is never permanent, because while Birchwood settled into uneasy resignation, the evidence was waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right eyes.
By the 25th year, the Sanders case was no longer a story that led the evening news or made the front page. It had slipped into the background noise of unsolved tragedies, known, remembered, but seldom spoken of outside anniversaries. To many, Emily had become a ghost of the past. But for her family and for Detective Hanley, the case never let go. The Sanders household bore the marks of time. Emily's mother, hair gone silver, still walked each morning to the mailbox with a flicker of hope that never came true. Sometimes she'd pause on the porch, staring down the road as though expecting her daughter to return, grown but alive. Her father rarely spoke of Emily anymore. He carried her absence like an old injury, always there, always aching, but hidden under layers of silence. The walls of their home held photographs that hadn't changed in decades. Emily's school portrait, Emily with her friends by the lake, Emily's smile, forever 16. The community, too, had adjusted in quiet ways. The diner where she once worked had passed through new owners, but locals still lowered their voices when telling newcomers about the girl who never came home. Teachers at the high school mentioned her name in hushed tones, a cautionary story for students who stayed out too late. And at church, her name was still spoken during candlelight vigils, though fewer candles were lit each year. For investigators, the file grew dusty. Budget cuts shifted resources to newer cases, leaving Emily's folder buried beneath more recent tragedies. Younger detectives glanced at the thick stack of reports, shaking their heads at how little could be done with such dated evidence. Leads were exhausted, suspects cleared, witnesses faded into unreliable memory. Even Hanley, now long retired, carried the case like a shadow. He kept clippings in a box under his bed, opening it on sleepless nights, reading old notes as though the answer might suddenly appear. Life went on in Birchwood, but not evenly. For Emily's family, each day was lived on hold, every celebration incomplete, every milestone missing the one person who should have been there. Her brother, now with children of his own, confessed once at a town meeting, "I don't know how to tell my kids about their aunt. I don't know how to explain a story with no ending." And that was the truth of Birchwood's silence. The story had no ending, just an open wound stretched across decades, leaving the town suspended between memory and uncertainty. The case was not closed. Officially it remained active, but in practice it was frozen like the snow that had first covered Emily's footprints, erasing them step by step, until one day the snow began to melt. It was a case no one expected to move again. By 2020, the disappearance of Emily Sanders had become part of Birchwood's folklore, an unsolved mystery passed from generation to generation. The detectives who had first worked it were retired or gone, the evidence box sitting in the archives like a coffin of unanswered questions. But the world had changed, and with it the science of truth. The call came quietly. A technician at the State Crime Lab had flagged an old sample during a digitization project. Among the evidence collected decades ago, a scarf, a broken necklace chain, and fragments of clothing was a faint trace of biological material overlooked in the original testing. It was small, nearly useless by the standards of the early 2000s, but technology had advanced. What once yielded nothing could now speak. The scarf was retested. This time the machines pulled out a partial DNA profile, not enough for certainty, but enough for hope. The lab fed it into CODIS, the national database. Days passed, then a match blinked on the screen. It was distant, not direct. A familial link. A relative of the unknown contributor had entered the system years later on an unrelated charge. The match wasn't perfect, but it was strong enough to narrow the pool. Detectives newly assigned to the reopened cold case dug into family trees. Names were cross-checked, addresses pulled, old records unearthed. And there it was, a connection to a man who had once lived in Birchwood during the late 90s. A man who had quietly left town the year after Emily disappeared. His name was Daniel Rourke. On paper, Rourke seemed unremarkable. He had worked odd jobs, moved frequently, and kept a low profile. But as detectives retraced his life, unsettling details emerged. Complaints from neighbors about him watching young women, a dismissal from a warehouse job under suspicious circumstances, a sudden relocation to another county without explanation. The Sanders case file was pulled back into the light. Hanley's old notes mentioned a man seen near the diner parking lot weeks before Emily's disappearance, someone whose name was never identified. Could it have been Rourke? The timing fit, the geography fit, and now the science pointed to him. Detectives began surveillance. Rourke, now in his 50s, lived alone in a trailer on the outskirts of a rural town. He worked sporadically, collected disability checks, and rarely spoke to neighbors. Investigators retrieved discarded items from his trash: coffee cups, cigarette butts, soda cans. Each was bagged and rushed to the lab. The results came back definitive. DNA on the discarded items matched the partial profile from Emily's scarf. After 20 years of silence, Birchwood had a suspect. News of the breakthrough spread like wildfire. Local reporters dug up old clippings, replaying grainy photos of Emily alongside the new name. The town, stunned, found itself ripped back into memory. Some wept, some grew angry, others whispered that they had always suspected an outsider. For Emily's family, the call from police was surreal. Her mother clutched the phone, silent as tears streamed down her cheeks. Her brother, now hardened by decades of waiting, felt a strange mix of relief and fury. Relief that someone would finally answer for her disappearance, fury that he had lived half his life without knowing the truth. But truth was not yet complete. Detectives needed more than a match. They needed a confession, or a body, or evidence tying Rourke directly to Emily's last moments. Without it, the case remained a fragile bridge built on circumstantial ground. Still, for the first time in decades, Birchwood had something it had long thought impossible: a name, a face, and the promise of answers. And for Detective Hanley, now in the twilight of his years, the news was both vindication and torment. He had been right to never let go, yet the question remained: what had happened to Emily in those final hours? The answer lay not in science but in confrontation. And that moment was coming. The name Daniel Rourke did not appear like a thunderclap. It crept in, quiet but undeniable, sliding from whispers in the case file into the hard glare of a reopened investigation. To the detectives newly assigned, he was at first just another lead. To those who remembered Birchwood in 2003, he was a ghost from the periphery, an unfamiliar face glimpsed once or twice before fading into obscurity. Now, with the weight of DNA pointing his way, the ghost had substance. Rourke's profile began to unfold in stark, unsettling detail. Born in Ohio, he had drifted across the Midwest, picking up temporary jobs and moving whenever ties began to form. His work history was scattered: construction sites, warehouses, seasonal farm work. Employers described him as quiet, sometimes standoffish, often gone without explanation. On paper he was a loner. In reality he was a shadow. Detectives traced his history around Birchwood during the winter of 2003. He had been renting a small apartment above an auto repair shop at the edge of town, only blocks from the route Emily walked the night she vanished. Neighbors recalled little about him, except the way he kept to himself and the habit of lingering outside at odd hours, smoking in the cold. He had no strong ties to the community, no friends anyone could name, just another face in the background, easily forgotten, but hindsight sharpened memories. One neighbor recalled seeing him watch from his balcony as young women walked past after leaving the diner on late shifts. Another remembered his rust-colored pickup truck parked on back roads near the old quarry, an image that resurfaced in their mind after detectives came knocking. The behavioral profile matched too well. Investigators pieced together fragments: a man who avoided authority, who changed jobs to avoid scrutiny, who moved states the year Emily vanished. Rourke was never questioned in 2003, not seriously. He had slipped through the cracks, invisible in a community, desperate to believe the danger had come from outside, not among them. Surveillance began in earnest. Detectives tailed his truck, catalogued his routines. He drove short distances, visited a grocery store once a week, and spent most of his days shut inside his trailer. Cameras tracked him, phones were monitored, every movement weighed. They collected more DNA discarded on napkins and cans, building the chain of certainty. But certainty was not enough. To confront him, detectives needed to understand not just who he was, but who he had been. His criminal history, thin at first glance, revealed disturbing patterns: a trespassing charge dismissed in Ohio, an accusation of harassment at a factory job, never pursued, and a sealed record from another county, suggesting an incident with a teenage girl years earlier. The pattern was predatory, hidden beneath layers of neglect and time. The tactical planning was deliberate. They studied his schedule, his habits, the layout of his trailer and the surrounding land. The fear was not only that he might run, but that in cornering him he might lash out violently. The case was fragile. A misstep could unravel 2 decades of waiting, and yet tension grew heavier with every day of surveillance. Detectives debated whether to wait for a confession, to pressure him into a mistake, or to move quickly before he vanished again. After all, hadn't he done just that in 2003, slipped away into another life, while Birchwood searched for Emily in vain? The family was briefed in careful, measured tones. Emily's mother sat in silence, listening as detectives explained the man they believed responsible. Her face trembled, torn between relief and rage. Her son, fists clenched, demanded why no one had found him sooner. The answer was one detectives carried as guilt. The science hadn't been ready, the pieces hadn't fit, and Rourke had been just careful enough. Now, however, there was no more hiding. The net was closing. Undercover officers approached him in public places, casually to test his reactions. They noted the way his eyes darted when strangers lingered too long, the stiffness in his posture. He seemed perpetually alert, as if expecting to be recognized. A man who had spent 20 years guarding a secret. Detectives pored over Hanley's old notebooks, comparing his descriptions of the shadowy figure from early witness reports with Rourke's timeline. The pieces locked together with chilling precision. Even Hanley, though long retired, returned to the station to see the evidence for himself. His voice cracked when he whispered, "It was him. I knew we were circling something, but we never had the net." The hunt tightened around a single truth: Daniel Rourke had been hiding in plain sight all along. But still, questions remained. Would he confess? Would he fight? Could he finally reveal what happened to Emily on that frozen night in 2003? The answers would come soon. Inside an interrogation room, the knock came at dawn.
Officers in plain clothes approached the small weather-worn trailer where Daniel Rourke had lived in isolation for nearly a decade. The air was cold, the ground damp from the night's frost. Inside, Rourke was still half asleep when the sound of fists on metal jolted him upright. "Daniel Rourke, police." "Open the door." He hesitated. For a moment there was only silence, the faint rustle of movement behind the thin walls. Then the door creaked open. Rourke stood barefoot, his face drawn, his eyes shifting as though calculating an escape. But there was no escape. He was ordered outside, placed in handcuffs, and led to an unmarked car. Neighbors peered from their windows, whispering, watching a man they barely knew be taken away. At the station, the interrogation began. Detectives laid out the evidence piece by piece: the DNA match, the surveillance, the accounts of his past behavior. Rourke leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, denying everything at first. His voice was flat, almost rehearsed. "I don't know her, never seen her." But the evidence kept coming. Photos of Emily, maps of Birchwood in 2003, the scarf with his DNA embedded in its fabric. Each detail chipped away at the wall he tried to build. Hours passed. Silence hung heavy between questions. Detectives watched his every flicker, every hesitation. Finally the tension cracked. Rourke's composure wavered. He rubbed his face, his breathing quickened. Then the words slipped out. Not a full confession, but enough. "She shouldn't have been walking alone." The room froze. Detectives leaned in. "What happened that night, Daniel?" His story came in fragments, muttered and broken. He claimed it wasn't planned, that he had seen her walking, followed her, confronted her near the edge of town. He described a struggle in the snow, his hands gripping tighter than he intended. He said it was over too fast, that panic consumed him. When pressed about what he had done with her body, he shut down, eyes fixed on the table. "I don't remember," he whispered, though investigators knew he did. His refusal was not ignorance, it was control. Even in confession, he held back the one truth the family needed most. Yet the forensic evidence, and his own admissions were enough. Combined with his history, the DNA match, and his relocation after the disappearance, the case against him was unshakable. The arrest was formalized. News cameras captured the moment he was led in shackles through the courthouse steps. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward. Rourke said nothing, head bowed, his face a mask of exhaustion. For Emily's family, the day was surreal. Her mother wept as she saw him on the news, whispering, "That's the man who took her." Her brother clenched his jaw, saying only, "Now he'll face what he did." Inside the department, Detective Hanley sat quietly in the back of the briefing room. His hands trembled as he held the official report. 2 decades of chasing shadows had finally ended in one name, one arrest. He whispered to himself, "Justice at last." But justice was imperfect. The answers were incomplete. Emily was still gone, and Rourke refused to reveal where. For her family, closure was only partial. They had a name, a face, a conviction, but not a grave. Still, after 20 years of silence, Birchwood finally had resolution. The town exhaled, but in the silence after, one question lingered: what becomes of a community after truth finally comes to light? The case was closed, but the story did not end. In Birchwood, time moved forward, yet the echoes of Emily Sanders's disappearance lingered in every streetlight and every snow-covered sidewalk. The town that had once been defined by innocence now carried a scar, visible in the way neighbors spoke in hushed tones when her name was mentioned, or the way mothers pulled their daughters closer on winter nights. For Emily's family, the arrest brought both relief and torment. Her mother kept a framed photograph of Emily on the kitchen table, fresh flowers placed beside it each week. She said justice had come, but her voice trembled when she admitted it wasn't enough. "I still don't know where she is," she whispered. "I can't lay her to rest." Her brother spoke of anger more than closure, anger at years lost, at birthdays uncelebrated, at the silence that had haunted them for 2 decades. Detective Hanley, retired yet never truly free of the case, stood at the edge of Birchwood Cemetery one autumn afternoon. He had not come to visit a grave, for there was none. He came instead to reflect on the years consumed by one unanswered question. He thought about the advances in technology, how a fragment of DNA had succeeded where endless interviews and sleepless nights had failed. He admitted quietly, it was the science that solved it, not me, not anyone else, just time and progress. The town too reflected on its long vigil. Community meetings, once filled with speculation, became gatherings of remembrance. Local schools invited speakers to talk about safety, resilience, and the dangers that can hide in plain sight. For the younger generation, Emily was no longer just a girl who vanished, but a reminder of how fragile ordinary life could be. Yet the story carried a broader weight. Across the country, law enforcement agencies pointed to Birchwood as a testament to the power of persistence and science in solving cold cases. The Sanders case became a rallying cry that no file should ever be left forgotten, no evidence permanently dismissed as too small. Forensic technology had given Emily a voice when memory could not, and still, beneath the lessons and the justice, the haunting question remained: how many more Emilys are out there? How many more families wait in silence, not knowing? The final winter scene in Birchwood seemed unchanged: snow on rooftops, children playing, lights glowing faintly through frosted windows. But those who remembered knew it would never feel the same. Safety was an illusion, and memory was fragile. Emily's footprints had once stopped abruptly on a quiet street. 2 decades later, the truth had emerged, but the echoes of silence would never fade.